right, where you can select your own geography and get output on in terms of the buildings, businesses, people that are involved within that geography that you select, or you can submit your own shape file. But there I've just selected the Brisbane LGA. The population modelling in that though is static. It's based on what was reported on in the most recent census. So that is great if it's 10 o'clock on census night or whatever, but not necessarily the best thing we can use if we've got a sudden onset event. So we've done a little bit of work within this community safety branch, looking at, hope everyone's been able to hear me, looking at sudden onset hazards. So one was a Melbourne earthquake scenario, and another one is not relevant to the Natural Hazards Research Forum, but we do some counter-terrorism work as well. So we've used a dynamic population model in Sydney to put people in different locations when a terrorist might detonate a device. A lot of words there, so I won't go through all of them, but basically the Melbourne case study was looking at an earthquake scenario, and we wanted to be able to place people in the CBD during a work day, for example, rather than on census night. The focus of that work was on unreinforced masonry retrofit. So for those of you who don't know, unreinforced masonry buildings are particularly vulnerable to earthquake shaking. They have a whole heap of features that are, will easily topple. So an example is a parapet or a chimney or a gable end of a building. And those falling masonry potentially is clearly very dangerous to pedestrians and also the occupants of the building. So we wanted to be able to estimate people that were going to be in the street at the time of this theoretical earthquake. There's a whole heap of inputs you can see there. Probably the key one, and the one that we did have to pay for, unfortunately, is the telco smartphone derived data, where they've got, Big Brother is watching, they've got very good information on people that are aged 18 and older, is all they'll release, but where they are in 15-minute increments in the CBD, and those are defined by ABS destination zones. So each destination zone is approximately the size of a city block, and the telcos know how many people are in there that are using their service, I guess. And then you can pretty easily then upscale that based on how many under 18s you think have phones, and also then the proportion of customers that particular telco has. And then we did a bit of adding and subtracting. So using that as the base, we then looked at a variety of different ways of people would move around. So City of Melbourne were our collaborators in this, so we got very good access to their data, as you'd expect. And so we were able to look at pedestrian movements, which are open source anyway. The SCATs I'll talk about on the next slide, but that's traffic movement throughout the city. We did pay again for public transport passenger movements. So doing a whole heap of adding and subtracting, we were able to come up with a model that had different people in different locations, different days of the week and different times of the day. And so I guess at the moment this has been used for a couple of case studies, but the work we are putting into it now can feed into a statistical model later that should be, we hope, would be very useful in terms of situational awareness at a particular time. I guess I did also point out that we've used this for sudden onset hazards, because once something that is, you have a warning, all of this behaviour will sort of go out of the window, where people might be returning to a property or running away from a property. So this is based on something happening really quickly while people are going about their daily business. And that's sort of the pedestrian density thing, one of the pedestrian density things that we came up with for the City of Melbourne, where red is very dense and it tends to be near the railway stations. And then you can sort of see those other ones where down to blue is low density of pedestrians. So SCATS is actually called the Sydney Coordinated Adaptive Traffic System, but it's used in just about all the cities in Australia and New Zealand now. So it was adopted for use in Victoria quite some time ago, and it basically is vehicle movement counts through intersections summed in 15-minute intervals. And again, it's open source, so you should be able to access that for most of our big cities, if that's something you're interested in. And then we did a little bit of work, I guess ground truthing that with some high resolution imagery to look at different vehicle types that were being counted. So it'll just give you a count of vehicles moving in the two different directions through an intersection, or multiple directions, sorry, through an intersection. But it won't tell you what sort of vehicles they are, so it won't tell you if it's a Mini Cooper or a bus. So we did a little bit of work trying to do some ground truthing there. Yep, I'm almost done. Second last slide. And this is Craig's work, so any mistakes I make here are mine, not his. But this is another one that we've sort of got a prototype level, I suppose, where we're looking at doing predictive impact maps for tropical cyclone, where Craig and his team can take bureau forecasts of a cyclone track and run that through to where we're looking at damage to residential buildings, I think, at those different geographies. I'm not sure exactly what the geography is, but again, red is bad, green is good, and that might be something that can be used, well, ahead of a tropical cyclone, but also as it's happening in terms of predicting where the most damage might be in particular locations. Craig did ask me to stress that there's uncertainty the whole way through this in the cyclone track and its behaviour. In our knowledge of the exposure, so we do have a bit of knowledge, but it's never perfect, and also in the vulnerability models. So when we create these vulnerability models, they're usually designed to be used on a population of buildings that are very similar to each other. So the answer won't always be right at a building, but if you're looking at a suburb or a postcode, you would hope that you'd sort of getting the right types of numbers across that. The other thing with this is at the moment we're only looking at the wind there. Obviously a tropical cyclone has a few different facets to it. So a lot of rain, potentially a storm surge, potentially flooding afterwards. So this aspect we're looking at here is only looking at the wind. And Craig did also ask me to stress that this had been done with a lot of consultation with our collaborators who have sort of driven this process. And the next step probably now is to try and start ground truthing a little bit, assuming we get more tropical cyclones, and I'm sure we will. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take questions now or during the panel session. If there's anything I can't help you with, or anything you think of later, that hazards@ga.gov.au will get you into our client services system, so it won't just sit there unattended. It'll be logged and we actually have to respond to it. So that's better than, say, emailing me and potentially not getting the response you want. Thank you.
We do have a couple of questions there. It's really hard to read. Given the flood levels are at the gauge, what needs to be done and how can we provide more localised levels for community members?
So that actually does require a fair bit of work. So strictly that would require like hydrological modelling of a catchment. Now the Bureau can do that, it's time consuming, but one thing that you could do is basically create a library of different flood maps. So as water levels are rising, it's not just a bathtub, there's a whole heap of different things that influence the way that flood water moves. But you could basically pre-can a library of different flood events, and that would be one way to deal with that rather than trying to do it on the fly, which they can also do, but it is costly in terms of computation and time.
You mentioned that you could do flood inundation mapping showing vulnerable groups, such as elderly and those who have special needs. Where do you get this data from and to what level of granularity?
So that we do get from the census, and we're actually, I guess as a government partner, able to get that at record level. I guess this is one of the things in terms of us being a publicly funded agency. We like to have most of our information publicly available, and that's generally the ethos that we work with. But the things like that we're only able to put out at an aggregated level. So you're not able to say the income of that house, as reported in the census, was X dollars. So you can get it to a particular geographical level, and we can put that out. But we actually do get access ourselves at record level from the Bureau of Statistics.
The final question there.
Yep. Is that the environmental data? Yes. So when I showed the shake map, I showed two different maps with the earthquake. So the shake map is basically generated from our knowledge of that earthquake itself, and then the way that the waves will propagate out through hard rock and also be potentially amplified by soils at the surface. But that's we're a very big country, and we do have plenty of seismic stations, but by the nature of our country, they are very far apart. We're not always able to very well locate earthquakes. So I can't remember what the error was in that Woods Point one, and if I did, I might not even want to tell you. Or the possible error ellipse, I mean. So it is very difficult unless they actually create a fault scarp on the surface of the ground to know exactly where an earthquake has occurred. So that's our first estimate, and then we sort of start feeding that ground truthing from people in. But again, it's also imperfect. So people are talking about what they've experienced, whether that sounded like a train going past, or the teacups were rattling, or we've got a crack in the wall. That crack in the wall is also a bit subjective. So is their house 100 years old? Does it have existing damage already? Are they on shrink, swell, sort of clays, things like that? So it sort of does feed in to give us a better feel, but I suppose the point I was trying to make with the felt grid is that is almost immediately available, and it is representing what people have experienced. So if your house had collapsed, you're probably not going to jump on your phone and put in a felt report, but as damage is getting greater, we should be able to sort of get a feel for that. I should have also said that those grids only get published if there's enough reports coming in from them. So each of those isn't one individual. There's enough in there to give us a bit of confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Please welcome our second speaker, Dr. Matthew Mason from the University of Queensland. Prior to being at the University of Queensland, Matt was working for Risk Frontiers at Macquarie University, and his interests are, it's a long list here.
I can introduce myself.
Excellent.
All right. Okay.
Here, take it, Steve.
All right. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. Okay, so what I will talk today about is some work that's been going on really for the last 8 to 10 years, and really probably in full disclosure in the background of the work we do day in, day out. But what we've been looking at is trying to develop a network of weather stations that allows us to monitor tropical cyclones in real time, but also to archive that information so that it can be used later on for a range of different purposes. And this is sort of joint work that's going on between myself and also researchers at James Cook, at the Cyclone Testing Station at James Cook University. And really they do a lot of the heavy lifting as far as building the system and deploying it, because they're up where cyclones are, and I'm the computer monkey sitting here trying to do all the coding and so on in the background. All right, and I think Cora is here. I can't see him in the audience. Oh, there he is, up the back. So if you want to ask any hard technical questions about putting weather stations out in the field during a tropical cyclone, he's the man to talk to. All right, so the system is called SwellNet, and the sort of, because with all these things you have to come up with an acronym. So it's the Surface Weather Information Relay and Logging Network. So the history of it is that we sort of conceptualised it, and at the time I was working at Risk Frontiers, but what we really noticed was that we have a relatively sparse network of anemometers in the north of Australia. So cyclones can sometimes come, make landfall, and we have almost no observational records of them. This is certainly getting better and better as time goes along and more stations go out. But there's still a long coastline and not lots of weather stations out there. So the objective was to try and develop a system that allowed us to take weather stations out and put them in the way of where we thought the storm was going to make landfall, so that we could record some of this information. So as I said, it was conceptualised in 2012. We got some funding, some seed funding from the Queensland government, also through James Cook and Risk Frontiers at the time, to build an initial system. And then in the subsequent time, so the 10 years since then, we've built the system and we've taken it out and tested it. So the first deployment was in Tropical Cyclone Dylan, which was in 2014. Not a particularly strong storm, but it was actually quite a good one to sort of start testing this type of system. So the aims, and I'll get to actually showing you what it looks like in a second, but the aims of what we were trying to do was really to capture some high fidelity records of the near surface winds during landfalling tropical cyclones. And this is along the Queensland coastline, and part of being a very long coastline means you can't actually get very far very quickly, and the road network is such that it doesn't sort of facilitate you getting to many locations. So we really are, with the sort of what we have at the moment, we're constrained to doing the Queensland coast and really only up to about Cooktown, because we can't go too much further than that without the risk of not being able to get back for a very, very long time. And the objective was not just to record, say, the strongest wind of the cyclone. That's not our objective. Our objective was to understand what is the wind speed and the wind environment within communities that are being affected. So if we were going to take the purely scientific approach to this, what we do is we would find a really open field near where we think the centre of the storm is going to cross, and that's where we'd be putting our instruments. But that's not what the buildings feel, that's not what the communities feel, and that doesn't help us when we're trying to do things like help Ken develop fragility models or vulnerability models for these communities. We then have to make a lot of inference about, well, this is what it is out in the middle of an open field, but what is it over there where the buildings that got damaged were, and so on. So we're really trying to embed them within the instruments within the communities, but that in and of itself presents quite a few problems, because how do you put it within a community without making it very specific to that location? Because we have to then try and do some other stuff with it. So we wanted to complement existing fixed networks. As I said, the Bureau has their own network of anemometers, weather stations, and we're really trying to complement that. So if there is a weather station if there's already an existing weather station in a location, we don't plonk one right next to it. We look at where they are and how we can sort of deploy to add additional information to that. So the sort of, and really what you're probably already getting is this was developed as a scientific research project. It wasn't developed to generate lots of information straight away for the emergency management community, but that is certainly an application of the information we're getting. So the original objectives were really from a scientific point of view. We want to learn more about the tropical cyclone boundary layer. It's a very energetic environment that we have a lot of theories on, but not a lot of actual practical observation. So we want to try and improve that. And from an engineering perspective, we want to inform the development of vulnerability models, improving building codes, and also to inform damage assessments. So as part of the work, certainly that James Cook and Cyclone Testing Station do, as well as GA after these events, is going out and looking at the damage that has occurred. And if we have direct measurements of what were the actual wind speeds, we can have a very nice linkage between, well, at this wind speed, we had this damage, and then we can draw lessons from that. So this is sort of what we have. So at the moment, the network is 6 rapidly deployable towers, where we measure wind speed relative humidity, pressure, temperature, and at a couple of sites we also have real-time video feeds from what's going on. These are logged locally at 10 hertz, so 10 times per second. So as you might imagine, we leave that going for a couple of days, you get a lot of data. So we don't have a feed of that real high frequency data, but every 10 minutes we get summary data, and it's that data that we actually, we'll see in a minute, gets fed to a website that has real-time observations from the stations. So the last bit is we've now got, and this has really sort of come about over the last couple of years, we have working with the councils along the Queensland coast, we now have 25 fixed sites. So one big difficulty with trying to do this and trying to do this quickly is identifying sites where we're actually allowed to put the towers in. So a bit hard to see, but here, to ensure that this doesn't go flying around and causing more damage than is already being done, we have to anchor them down quite a bit. So we have to have a sort of about a ½ metre big screw that you normally use to hold down a house, gets screwed into the ground. So we have to make sure that it's safe to do these in certain areas. So trying to find locations is often quite time consuming and tricky to do on the run. So we're working slowly through and trying to find sites that are predetermined and we have permission and we can set in initial fixings, which could be a big block of concrete under the ground that we just hook onto when we get in there. Now, through some funding initially, some seed funding from NHRA, we've now been able to also add an additional 2 towers that we had at the University of Queensland, but we're integrating it into the system, so we'll now have 8 that we can deploy. And through some other funding through the QRRF, and I can never remember the order of the R's, but it's Queensland Risk Reduction and Resilience Fund, I think, through QRA. To try and develop 10 new sites, some of which will be permanent sites along the coast, which again will feed into hopefully the existing network. All right, so what comes out of it at the moment? In real time, what we have is whenever we deploy them, we have a site through the cyclone testing station where you can go there and see. And this was just the last deployment was during Tropical Cyclone Kimi. Wasn't a particularly strong one, but we deployed anyway because it's always good to get out and make sure we have the processes in order. So you can access the location of where the towers are, and you can also access information about the wind speeds that are measured at them. So the wind, the pressure, and also the cameras. I've got a picture of the cameras, but when the cameras are out, you can actually see what's going on at some of those locations. Now, we also have a number of end users that sort of have engaged with the project over the last few years, and to those we have currently worked through this, and this is really what the NHRA work is, to try and take this from being a very ad hoc type push out of information to the end users to being a much more streamlined process. But what the end users are able to do is access exact locations. So here you can get approximate locations through the website, but because we don't want to tell people necessarily exactly where they are, because one, we don't want people going to steal our weather stations, but also anyway. So to the actual end users, we provide the exact location, and that's useful if you're want to do an accurate wind field model, because you need to know, well, is the station sitting on top of a hill or is it in a valley that might impact what is actually coming through and measured at the site that you might need to adjust for. And so we also do some conversion. So what you're getting out of the station is a wind speed at 3 metres high, which is not the same as the wind speed you get from the Bureau. So you can't just we get, say, 200 kilometres an hour from our site is not the same as 200 kilometres an hour that you see on the Bureau's webpage, or they give you that this storm has a 200 kilometre an hour wind speed. They're not the same. So there is some conversion that does get done that we do push out. So as I said, yeah, the work through NHRA is to try and make that push out more streamlined, but also to also build a historic repository. So all the data we've already collected, to get it into a nicely curated and accessible format, so that anyone that wants to come back and look at trying to understand some previous tropical cyclones, that information will be there as well. So the deployments we've had, we've taken it out about 6 times, I think 6 times, and a couple of sort of strong events. So we had it out during Cyclone Debbie, and that's this deployment here. So we actually had quite a good, so the dotted line here is the track of Debbie coming in. That's one of our sites there. Bureau sites are in blue. So we were able to generate a larger spread of information around what was already there. And that's allowed us to do quite a number of interesting things. What we've been able to do with it, and this is the case of Debbie, what we were able to do following the event was take all the wind speeds that were measured from our sites, the Bureau sites, and the yellow one was actually a storm chaser, had a weather station they put out as well. But we could integrate all of that and create sort of an impact, sort of wind speed footprint map as the storm came ashore. And why this was useful was what we did was take what we estimated to be the wind speed, divided that by what's called the V500, or the wind speed that essentially most buildings in that site were designed to resist, most new buildings. And we could say, well, here actually out on Hamilton Island, we got wind speeds that were essentially the design wind speed event. And we can present the data in such a way that although we would say here we've got a Cat 4 storm that's come the whole way through, not everyone here has actually experienced the same wind speed, and we can produce that information. From a more scientific point of view, one of the interesting things, this is also from Debbie, is we found quite a number of observations of very, very large gusts in the event. So from our theoretical understanding of the way the mean wind speed translates into a peak or a gust wind speed, if you think of it here, don't worry about too much of it, but the dashed red line is the average wind speed over a given period. This line is what we expect the maximum gust would be associated with that. But here what we're getting is something that's about 25% higher. And to be honest, we don't know why we're getting these extreme gusts, but it happened 3 or 4 times on the way down into the eye of Debbie. And if we're getting sort of this type of kind of unknown gusting occurring quite often, this will trigger damage. And we need to try and understand why these things are occurring. I won't go through that because it'll take too much explanation. So the last slide here I'll really go to is how does this sort of improve some of our situational awareness? And in real time, I think we're generating more data that can be used to verify forecasts, or could be used by forecasters, but could also feed into something like Ken was talking about with the impact forecasting models. Those types of models require quite a lot of real-time information, but certainly the uncertainties that are associated with them can be reduced if we have more information going in. So pushing information to that sort of application is quite useful, or can be quite useful. So more data is also available to try and plan response activities or estimate where you expect damage is going to be. But the point that I said, but these are only true if it gets used. And to be 100% sort of frank about it, I don't know if our data is getting used. So we have some people we know use it, but we would love it if more people were using it. So long term, the archives can also create a range of different information that allows us to do better historical characterisation of what the storms were, and it allows us to inform decisions around sort of how buildings have responded, and then that might feed back into building code adjustments. And I think, the last thing is certainly very, very happy to hear from different agencies or industries if this information is useful to you, how it would be useful, and potentially, we're out there putting instruments up in these pretty horrendous places. So if there's a little bit extra that could be done to help your agency better respond, we'd like to hear about that and sort of incorporate it into what we do. Okay, thank you. these are all questions for me. Okay, all right. All right, interest from WA or NT. So I think there has been some discussion with WA and NT, and maybe Cora can add to that. There is the idea that we potentially could try and have not have to take all the instruments everywhere. So we could have essentially some instruments located at different sites and be able to have people trained to fly in and deploy them. We have no sort of concrete plans to incorporate that larger geographical region at this stage, but that'd be great. Yeah. That's it. Good. Okay.
Thank you, Matt. So we're going to take a little bit of a U-turn now and kind of go post-tech design. And also I'd like to welcome Chloe Begg from the Country Fire Authority. Chloe hails from the CFA and has previously worked in Europe working for the Helmholtz Centre for Environmental Research. Welcome, Chloe.
Thank you, Loriana, and thank you all for joining me in this presentation today. I had the feeling I'm losing my voice, so I really hope that I get through all these slides, but just in case I get a bit croaky and need to drink, I apologise in advance. So it's wonderful to be here today and to have this opportunity to present at the first NHRA Research Forum. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're meeting today, the Turrbal people and the Agra people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm Chloe Begg. I work at the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, and I'm going to present to you today. We're taking a bit of a change of pace, a bit of a different focus. I'm going to present the Predictions in Public project, and I'm going to explain how we're using research to facilitate the development of a national approach to public-facing predictive fire spread maps. So it's a different pace because the project has only just begun. It's been funded by NHRA. Well, not only just begun, but we're in the kind of initial stages. So we're just we're in the thick of collecting our first phase of empirical data. So we don't have any research findings or any product to present to you today. So I'm going to focus more on, well, what's the process that we're using to develop this national approach? So I'll start the presentation with an overview of the project and then introduce the concept of co-design, how we're using it in the project, talk a little bit about the lessons that we've learned so far by using this approach, and then walk through some of the next steps of the project. So as I mentioned, the project has been funded by NHRA and it began this year in February. It is coordinated by the Country Fire Authority and Emergency Management Victoria. And the key question that we're really trying to focus on with this research is we're aiming to understand or develop a clearer understanding of the role of fire predictions in agency communications with the public during an emergency. So why should we focus on the role of predictions in public? I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what my role is at CFA. So as Loriana mentioned, before starting my role at CFA, I worked as an academic for over 10 years in the social sciences, and I currently work in a team at CFA. We're lucky enough to have an R&D team, and we have over 10 or around 10 researchers that are in that team. So we have people who have worked in academia who have expertise in areas such as social science, remote sensing, climate science, fire behaviour science, and operational research. So we have a great opportunity having these people embedded within the organisation to be able to understand or work together with agency staff to better understand the challenges that we face within the sector and to try to figure out what the research contribution is for addressing those challenges. And why the focus on predictions in public? So as part of that scanning around CFA and looking across the sector for what are those burning issues that we're currently dealing with as a sector, this idea of what is the role of all these products that the BOM and the other presentation, there's so much research. We have so much capability. There's so many advances in technology that allow us the opportunity to access and to create really fantastic situational awareness and technologies. There's also an expectation from the public that this real-time information during an incident is being provided to people to make informed decisions about what they should be doing. We've heard from other presentations that we keep on getting recommendations from reviews, inquiries, the Royal Commissions. We need to improve our warnings. We need to make them more accurate. We need to make them more timely. There's also political pressure that's increasing. During the 2020 fire season, we saw the release of Red Maps, a predictive product showing the predicted fire spread in New South Wales and the ACT. And now there are questions, not just in New South Wales and the ACT, but across all jurisdictions. Should we be developing these? Should we be thinking about what capabilities we need, what resourcing? Should we be automating this? What should we be doing to make sure that, should we even have these products during future fire seasons across all jurisdictions? And we did a little bit of research in Victoria a couple of years ago, and we asked operational researchers, well, what do you think? Should this information be released to the public? And overwhelmingly, people told us that yes, of course, more information is better, but there were concerns about how to effectively embed these new products into existing warning products and when and how they should be released to the public. So we saw this research, and we're glad that NHRA did too, as an opportunity to step back, to reflect, and to collect evidence that can help develop an evidence base to inform and support the decision-making for the future use of these products. So the research is interested in exploring the following questions. So we want to better understand what agencies perceive the role of these products to be across all jurisdictions. We want to better understand if predictive maps support or potentially conflict with existing public information and warning products. We're also really interested in how communities perceive existing products and comprehend and intend to use both existing products and predictive products that we will test in later stages of the project. We're interested in understanding how these maps should be designed, communicated and disseminated to the public as well. So we're deliberately using co-design in this project to answer these questions. And we've heard a little bit about co-design. It's been thrown around at the conference, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on explaining what we understand, how we're using this concept and what we understand it to be. So we chose to use the co-design approach because we wanted to ensure that the results of the project are usable and used. So as a definition of co-design, it's been defined here as the process of designing with the people that will use or deliver the product or service. And it's gaining momentum in different sectors. So in academia, the concept comes from product design and communication studies, but it's increasingly you see it in the climate change and the disaster risk reduction literature. There's often there's a lot of calls for this. We need to work smarter together. We need to be interdisciplinary. We need to work better with our end users. This idea that knowledge, no matter how fantastic our science is, no matter how fantastic our products are, knowledge doesn't translate itself. And the idea is, or the hope is, that if we co-design, then research utilisation will be improved. It's also language that's been increasingly used by governments. So, for example, the Victorian government defines co-production as bringing stakeholders, citizens and stakeholders together to design new products, services and policies. So this is an acknowledgement that just by producing these products, services and policies, it doesn't mean that the people who we intend to use those products and services have been engaged in that process or will actually use them. So there's that need, again, for that involving, or the idea is if you involve people through co-design, then you'll have more tailored, more appropriate and better outcomes. So it sounds really good, right? So co-design sounds fantastic. We have this acknowledgement that we need to work better together. But do we know, how do we achieve these fantastic outcomes through co-design? In other words, how do we do co-design? There are many stakeholder engagement tools from the academic literature, also from public service practice, but there's less of a focus on those factors or those things that specifically make co-design work or not. So we might not have, and that kind of makes sense as well, we might not have a recipe for co-design because every single problem that you're trying to solve, every single group of people who you want to work with, they're going to require different methodologies and approaches. But we can use principles, and I've borrowed these principles from Vincent and colleagues that I find quite useful, and they are collaboration, inclusion, and flexibility. So in terms of collaboration, it's about providing different people with different interests with opportunities to participate, and that can be anything from workshops, meetings, surveys, interviews. It matters how you do it, but the really important thing is inclusion. So if you're going to collaborate with people, there needs to be an opportunity for that input to be taken into account so people can actually have an influence on the decisions being made. It also needs to be flexible. We heard this in the panel this morning, that how do you do co-design? How do we make sure that we can actually influence the outputs at the beginning of the project? And there needs to be that flexibility to be able to shift directions in order to meet the project objectives. But there also needs to be really great project design so that we know we have a plan for what decisions need to be made when and how we're involving people and how we're including that, the input that they give us. So how is the Predictions in Public project doing this? What's our approach to co-design? In regards to, I'll use the 3 principles from my previous slide. So in regards to collaboration and inclusion, as I mentioned before, the project is led by CFA and EMV, and we have a team of researchers from 4 universities from around Australia with expertise in cardiography, evacuation, community evacuation modelling, community risk communication and warnings communication, and organisational learning. We also have a project steering committee, and that includes the AFAC warnings groups, representatives from that group, as well as the AFAC predictive services group from all jurisdictions. And we also have a representative from the Bureau of Meteorology. And the neat thing about having people like myself and Angela Gardner, who's the other coordinator, our role is really to sit in between the research and the end users, our steering committee, to make sure that there's a facilitated conversation so that there is that input and there is that inclusion and consideration of both parties' interests and needs. Because, yeah, it's very easy to say that you want to be inclusive, but then we all have our interests, and if there isn't that opportunity and openness for listening and for being flexible, then we're just going down the same path. In regards to flexibility, as I mentioned before, the proposed outcomes of the project is deliberately broad, and so are the phases. So we were, I think, quite lucky with NHRA that they funded the first phase, and that gave us some time to do a lot of work with our end users, our steering committee, to sort of understand, well, what is actually the research problem, and then in the second phase of funding to sort of tailor that a little bit, and we've left it still quite broad, and I think that's quite nice that we have set some sort of outputs that we think might be useful, but we've also said very clearly that that might change during the process of the research. So, excuse me. What are the potential benefits of this approach? We're hopeful that this approach will lead to improvements in research utilisation, and it will hopefully result in robust research on the one hand, but also research that's used and utilised. So we're also hopeful that through building relationships and sharing knowledge, that researchers will learn as much from agencies as agencies will learn from researchers. So it's less about transferring knowledge from over here and from one group to the other. It's really about that integration of that knowledge. And by providing these opportunities for communication and for conversations, we're trying to translate science, but we're also integrating different ways of knowing and expertise in order to develop that shared solution. In regards to the challenges, well, it takes time, it takes resources, and it takes patience. And the approach requires our steering committee and researchers to attend regular meetings so that we're keeping everybody up to date, we're we're talking through the different research pieces that we're doing, the empirical work. We're having those conversations right through the project to make sure that we have that co-defined problem, we talk about solutions, and we implement them together. So rather than the steering committee communicating a research need to the researchers and then the researchers going off and doing their research and coming back and presenting it, it's really that conversation, that negotiation, that learning together. So other challenges include the research not necessarily working within agency timeframes. Agency timeframes can be quite short and people want things quite quickly. But we're hoping, because we have that ongoing dialogue, that all that we'll be learning together through the project, so there will be that opportunity to take those lessons and hopefully embed them within decision-making processes during the project, as well as being able to use the outcomes after the project is completed. So this is my last slide. In terms of the next phase, or where we're at the moment, we're right in the middle of our first empirical work. We're in phase 1. We're conducting interviews and surveys with agencies and members of the community across all jurisdictions to understand what people perceive the role of existing public information and warnings. And in most jurisdictions, that's warning polygons. Because we need to understand that base level, what's already out there, so that we can better understand what the role of predictive products are in phase 2. And in phase 2, we'll be turning really towards that predictive product, and we would be testing map concepts again with communities in all jurisdictions, and we'll develop those map concepts together with our steering committee. The third phase focuses specifically on the outputs of the project and making sure that those outputs are fit for purpose and can be used once the project is complete. So we don't want the project to end and then there'd still be that need for that follow-up research to implement our findings. And the proposed practical outputs at this stage are national evidence-based principles for predictive fire spread map design, dissemination, communication and education, and that really comes out of the research through the phases. And it's less of a prescription and more of this is the evidence behind how these maps could look, when they should be disseminated, and how they can be communicated. And we've also suggested a communication and engagement framework, because although it's really important to make sure that the products that are released during an incident are very good and timely and all of the things, but it's also really important that we close the loop and make sure that the communities that should be using these products also understand what it means to them before they see them during an incident. So we're really pushing for that type of closing the loop and making sure that there's that communication and engagement. We've also suggested a evaluation framework, because again, we don't want the research and the learning and the continuous improvement to stop at the end of the project. We're hoping that there can be mechanisms put in place so that we're checking in when these products are being used and learning from them and improving them as we go. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'm glad. Yes, Anthony, it is part of the scope, definitely. To have some recommendations or the principles. There will be a principle focusing on when those maps should be disseminated and how. In regards to Josh's question, what were the concerns operational staff had about embedding predictions into warnings? It depends on the jurisdiction. So some jurisdictions are already talking about that. So Victoria, and it also depends because every jurisdiction is different. That's why the phase 1 is so important, because not all jurisdictions use polygons, for example, New South Wales. But then other jurisdictions, WA, Victoria, do use polygons in a kind of stepwise. So they'll have the advice, the watch and act, and the emergency warning all on the same map. And in their eyes, some people argue that that is also kind of predictive in nature. Whereas RFS is very much of the, no, these are two different products. So it's having, I think those conversations in and of themselves are quite useful. So the jurisdictions are sort of working through this together. So we don't know at this stage, and I didn't point that out, I should have. We don't know what that end product looks like. Of course, New South Wales is already sort of going down the red maps path, but we didn't set up this research to be then getting everybody to the same state as New South Wales. We really wanted to have that, okay, well, what is actually the point of these maps? And can we create that national approach as part of the Australian warning system? So, should I add some more, or should I?
We have a little bit, we have 5 minutes.
Okay. Anonymous asks, forecasts that can be wrong to the public is challenging due to the low risk tolerance of leadership and politics. Do you see a key challenge in your work will be moving this threshold to allow forecasts of fire spread to be issued? Yeah, and I guess that's part of it, isn't it? Working through how do we make sure, what is the place of these maps and how do we communicate them? How do we communicate that uncertainty? How do we link them? Like, one of the options could be that you have a red map type PDF, as the RFS used, and the ACT as well. And that is just a kind of hazard map at a state level, but you're leading people then back to the local warnings information through the polygon or through your platforms. I think, I think it's sort of coming, whether we like it or not. There's so much pressure for it, so I think it's more about how do we make sure that we're doing the best that we can to make sure that they are a good product, and the uncertainties, because there will be uncertainties, are then communicated appropriately. Okay. Keep going. Yeah, sure. Okay,
Thank you, Chloe. Now, I'm not sure if you, it's 11:56. We're supposed to finish at 12, so but I thought maybe we could go about 5 minutes over time and have a panel session for about 10 minutes, if that suits everyone. Yep. All right. Well, I'll have the. Oh, yeah?
Can we ask a question not using slide?
We can. Do we have a microphone? We'll need a microphone up here for...
I don't think I'll need a microphone.
I will need another one.
Not too bad. I'd just like to, the option of not using slide, I've been in a pandemic for the last couple of years. I'd like to take the opportunity not to rely on tech. If that's okay, and speak face to face with real people. Very shame. So my question to Chloe is, your project is all about public perception of predictive fire mapping, and you talk about co-design, but I couldn't see, as a member of the public, and even more so as an Aboriginal person, which I'm not, but as a member of an Aboriginal community, I couldn't see myself involved in that co-design in the working groups and reference groups that you set up. Is there an opportunity to perhaps get more co-design from a broader stakeholder group at the earliest stages of the project design?
Yeah, and I guess that's also just the problem of with having a scope of the project. So we did, of course, it would be wonderful to have more interactions with the community, but we, at this stage, have the steering committee which is focusing on agencies, and the way that we're involving the community is through having the national surveys, interviews, focus groups. We'll have eye tracking of the map concepts, and then a national survey at the end. So it is more, it could probably definitely be better, but that within the scope of the project that we had, that was the decision that we made to go with that approach.
Okay, we've got a question for the panel. So what do you think can be done in the future to better share things like impact and risk data between different organisations and types of organisations?
Well, that's a very good question. So we would typically try to have most of our data, as I said earlier, pretty open, but it does rely on people knowing where it is and how to access it. So I was sort of pumping up the tyres of the felt reports before, but of course those are only coming in from people who are aware that we have that capability and then use it. So I haven't really answered the question at all. I think having a particular sort of portal or place where people can access that information and grab it themselves is probably the best way to go, in my experience. But
Okay, and there any? I'll ask one of my own. In our imperfect emergency management sector, where research is being done often whilst we're responding to and recovering from emergencies, what does collaboration look like?
So an academic is probably not the right person to answer that question. But I mean, from I guess my experience, there's just the relationships have to be there before the disaster. It's very, very difficult to do that to make that happen, and particularly new relationships to get the information across during an event, because there's so much going on. So I think probably the importance of having systems and relationships in place before the events occur.
And I think this is something, I guess a question back to the audience as well, because it's something that we've been grappling with at CFA, and I think also in HRA as well, is that how do you set up these research projects that are broad enough that allow you to have kind of an overarching goal that all these projects are working towards, that you have that sustained sort of purpose regardless of what part of the season or year we're in. And also that's kind of a big question, because researchers, we can just do our jobs, but when it comes to collaboration, I think there's a way in our project we definitely were quite conscious of that, and then in that planning for when we were going to do the research and also have those interactions with communities and with our stakeholders, we had the bulk of the decision making being outside of the fire season. Like, that's one way you could do it, but I guess in terms of having that sustained research that's meeting a specific purpose, having really, really clear research problems that are structured in a way that we can have many different projects sort of filtering up to one goal. And I think, I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. So I don't know. Anybody else?
So I'd just like to reiterate what Matt was saying, that having those relationships in place ahead of time is I think critical. If we're talking about going in and trying to look at post-event damage, for example, that becomes a really fraught one for us, because we don't want to get in the way of people who might be still trying to recover. And we had the comment yesterday that there can be a bit of fatigue, so if an SES type person comes and talks to the householder, and then a week later their local government comes and talks to them to get an idea of, they don't want the feds then coming in 2 weeks later and asking them what they might feel are the same questions over again. So us, say, having a link, and I'll give an example. So Tweed Council, we have a pretty good relationship with their economic development unit. And so we were able to go, and one of my colleagues, Tariq from RMIT is here. He was actually able to go up to the Tweed Shire post-event, the flooding earlier this year. And because we had that relationship, he was actually going around with a member of the council. So it took a little bit of that issue out of people just suddenly fronting up and saying, I'm a researcher, I want to know how much damage you think happened to your business.
Okay, I've just got one last question. Earlier this morning we heard from First Nations people and the importance of the inclusion of First Nations people in our work. How have each of your panel members been able to include, or how are you looking to include First Nations people in the work that you do?
So we have a RAP as well, and it does, I guess, something that we've really only come to quite recently and probably been, I don't want to put my foot in it, but have not paid a lot of attention to up until quite recently. So we, as an agency, do all sorts of different types of field work. You know, we have minerals people who go out and dig trenches or dig up things. So now, before we do any field work, and I guess this is also important in post-event work, we have to have a mechanism for contacting the local custodians, making sure they're happy that we're actually doing that work. In some instances, if it might be near a particular site, we actually have to have someone with us at the time in case something is uncovered. So that is one way that we, I guess, are being inclusive in that space. But it's only something we've really come to quite recently, and it is something we're very cognisant of, I suppose.
I have no idea. So, yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, the way that we can sort of include them, include Indigenous voices and so on in it, would be through the teaching side of what we do. So the teaching of researchers to not necessarily go out and do this exact activity, but through the university to have better inclusion and sort of pass on, I guess the science understanding that we have. But also, I mean, there is opportunity, say, and this is not exactly what I talked about today, but say broader, say, tropical cyclone risk. Tropical cyclones have been occurring for a long time, and there's not just observational history or less Western observational history. There's a lot of Indigenous knowledge about where cyclones have been occurring, and a lot of this can come into and inform some of our, even the technical risk assessments we do around some of this climate work. We need to look at how some of that can be incorporated into our analyses, which is not easy, and it's not something that you put into a peer-reviewed literature, peer-reviewed paper very easily, but incorporating some of that additional information is very, very useful.
Thanks for the question. I mean, for the Predictions in Public project, that we don't have a specific plan for how to engage with Aboriginal people, and I think that that's probably something that we should consider. Our plan is more broadly community and the representative community voice, and as far as we can do that. I do know that at CFA there has been conversations and action around this, but I think it's definitely a space where we need to be doing more.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think we'll leave that there. Thanks everyone for attending. Lunch is available outside. Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people's continued contribution to the life and culture of the Meanjin region, and recognise that these lands and waters have always been places of teaching, research and learning. In the spirit of reconciliation, we extend this acknowledgement and respect to all First Nations people, including First Nations delegates here today. Welcome everyone. It's great to be here today, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session at the first Natural Hazards Research Australia Forum. My name is Loriana Bethune, and I'm the DELP Program and Node Manager at Natural Hazards Research Australia. Just a little bit of housekeeping, and it's particularly pertinent to the audience here, I'd say, is that we are currently embarking on a project looking at bushfire data and trying to collect bushfire data, and we really need your whatever bushfire data that you have available. So what we're doing is we're scoping the data availability and trying to understand where the knowledge gaps are and to build a national database. The research team are here at the forum, and it's Nader Pajau, and he would like to meet anyone who has bushfire data of any kind, and that means anyone from agencies or government departments or researchers. If you're willing to have a chat with him, that would be fantastic. But if you're a bit on the shy side, then we've got a QR code at the register desk, and you can go online and provide your contact details, and he can get in touch with you online. Thank you. Okay. The format of today's session will be 3 presentations on operational response. Our 3 presenters touch operational response from 3 very different angles, and I'm really looking forward to have that conversation at the end to see how they are having a different approach to utilisation. Once again, this panel is really quite specific, and so whilst we're talking about utilisation as we did yesterday, we're really going to be talking about where utilisation hits the ground. Please note, to ensure equal access for everybody, we are planning for all our questions to be asked on Slido. I'm hoping that you've already logged in, but if not, there are cue cards on your name badge, and or you can download the app or jump online, and whilst you're on your phone, you can also join the conversation on Twitter, which is NHRAF22. Thank you. So please welcome our first presenter, Peter Hayes from Central Queensland University. Peter is a research fellow at CQU, Appleton's Institute, and undertakes research in human factors and organisational psychology. His research largely focuses on teamwork, decision-making, and developing expertise through the use of simulation, coaching, and mentoring. His current research investigates the non-technical skills used by teams working in emergency response. Please welcome Peter.
Welcome, my name is Peter Hayes, and lovely to see you here today. I'm presenting work that's been largely undertaken by myself and my colleague Chris Spearman at the Appleton Institute. Before we get underway, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet on here today, and wish to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today's session, I'm going to be hopefully unpacking it in 3 lots. Up front, just a brief overview of the research that we've been undertaking, just to give you a sort of flavour of what are team monitoring tools, what are non-technical skills. Then move to talk a bit about how our basic tools have now been picked up and embedded and utilised by a variety of agencies, and talk a little bit about the journey that we've undertaken to enable that utilisation. And then lastly, just make some comments about the many opportunities for further research that stem from this and related fields. I'd also, hopefully along the way, make some points that may be echoed or maybe contrast with those my colleagues of Leigh and Mahesh. So hopefully by the time we have a perhaps panel session at the end, there's some opportunities to compare and contrast the different ideas we've got. Fairly word-heavy slide, but the sort of fundamental research that we've been focusing on has been about supporting emergency management team effectiveness. And that's emergency management teams working at regional and state level, but also incident management teams. And there's been 2 main lines of activity. One focused on simple tools that teams can use to actually manage themselves, monitor how they're performing, but also stay abreast of the key issues that they need to not forget, so prompts for them to stay on task and on track. And the research offers, I think, opportunities to address some issues or problems, but also to actually improve performance. So some of the obvious risks are all teams make errors, omissions, mistakes. Picking those up early and then doing something about them reduces the likelihood of those mistakes or errors or omissions translating into an adverse outcome. And of course, if these are difficult roles often, people are working long hours, stress, fatigue, high stakes. If we can reduce the strain and stress and strain by removing a little bit of that cognitive load, by actually creating more straightforward teams, then we actually provide the opportunity to create a better team environment. And on the other side, the flip side, we see opportunities coming from better preparing our teams for the future demands. So decision-making, situation awareness, communication, stress and fatigue are common issues that are repeatedly noted as troublesome for many teams. If we can support these teams with good behaviours, suitable behaviours to work in these teams, we can create more efficiency, more effectiveness, and better use of the resources. And of course, that's just a better environment. And given our ageing workforce, the fact that we've got continuing to have difficult times ahead, keeping the skilled people we have, practitioners, in those teams is valuable, but also making them an attractive place for people to come and work is also important. So as I mentioned those two lines of activity, the team monitoring tools. There's an example up the top there of one of our tools that's a key task cognitive aid, and it's really a checklist that helps teams think about or remind them of what I can't forget, particularly working at a regional or state control centre. And it's a simple tool that just reduces the cognitive load, but it also has other opportunities in terms of training. It also helps conceptualise the different phases of an incident into breakdown into 5 phases, which helps them think about which particular elements are going to be most important. And the second part, which has been our more recent work, has been focusing on non-technical skills. Now, they're described as the sort of set of cognitive, social, personal resource skills that actually complement technical skills and help teams to perform safely and efficiently. Now, although there's a newer label for them of non-technical skills, these are not new and in fact have been around for centuries, if not thousands of years. If you think of a mariner who's is a captain of a ship or a senior leader on a ship, they not only have to navigate the ship safely and efficiently using propulsion, changing sea conditions, changing weather conditions, but they need to do that safely, efficiently, and get their cargo or passengers from A to B in a safe and efficient way. And so alongside those hard technical skills of understanding those propulsion, navigation, they have a lot of management, decision-making, situational awareness, communication, coordination skills that are core to them performing or their team performing. The benefits of this research is, I think, first and foremost, is actually focusing on behaviours, and particularly those related to people interacting with others and how they think and appraise and analyse the world. Creating an agreed framework of desirable and undesirable behaviours for safe work. And importantly, creating some consistent and common language. And that's quite a challenge in our sector, that quite often we talk about things in different ways. But if we can create a lexicon, as was discussed yesterday, a common vocabulary, then we can actually help operationalise, train and develop people and talk about the same issues in the same way. Of course, lots of applications and the way we train, debrief, think about competence, and of course we look backwards to when things go wrong or don't go well. Non-technical skills actually provide an integrated framework to help us understand work in the space, and it can be used to better understand the implications of potential other interventions. If an agency or an organisation is thinking about changing or refreshing or bringing in a new leadership capability framework, then it would probably make sense to reference it across to a tool like this to see how it does or doesn't align with what we understand. The research approach we've primarily taken has primarily used a human-centred design approach, and that's been really important for us to develop and co-develop and effectively close the gap between the end users and agencies and us as researchers. So it's effectively a way of actually cooperating closely and carefully with agency personnel to actually develop, refine, and very often they have been key players in actually refining and helping us build these tools. So they've often been very central to the development of the products. Of course, we've used the normal other research tools that you would expect, plus things like hierarchical task analysis, which is really understanding the tier of activities that occur. And this has actually enabled us to produce 4 main products that you can see there. The the key tasks, cognitive aid we've talked about, a short team process checklist, quick and dirty for teams to understand the 3 C's of teamwork, communication, coordination, cooperation. The breakdown aid memoir, which helps us diagnose problems when teams have a disconnect, lack of communication, and MNOTS, the emergency management non-technical skills framework. In terms of some of the work we've been up to, this is just a sample of some of the various activities we've been about. Now, I won't unpack it all, but if we start at the far left-hand side, we can see some basic tools. That's the fundamental real estate talk materials we developed. And then we've continued to work with agencies, and developing those tools themselves was a significant journey, but we've continued to work with agencies, and they, for instance, have embedded some of those tools in their own doctrine, CFS, EMV for another set of tools. Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, importantly, helped you, with the aid of graphic designers, create and customise and actually make better and more attractive and more usable tools, which was important. We worked closely with EMV to develop some pilot workshops and then delivered those workshops which further refine those products, those training products for non-technical skills with a variety of agencies. We built a guide to non-technical skills with CRC support. And of course, we've been working quite closely with AFAC. We worked on a discussion paper with them that led to us working on the last of our current projects, which is a guide to embedding non-technical skills in the public safety training package units. And on the far right-hand side, there's a collection, and there's certainly more than that, of various ways agencies are now using those within the operational training and other activities. In terms of a quick schematic, one of the things we've been trying to do is think about how agencies can take advantage of tools, the tools we've developed. And this in the next slide just speak to the fact that, a bit like when we talk about sometimes communicating with the community, if we want to encourage and enable organisations to uptake something like non-technical skills, then we need to think about it at multiple levels, multiple intervention points. So up the top, we see the public safety training package. For most emergency agencies, that's their bread and butter training they use from a new inductee as a volunteer or as a recruit in ECS or fire services, etc., through to more advanced training as people take on more responsibilities. And there's the opportunity to embed non-technical skills much more strongly in that content, and that's what the current project's working on. And of course, EMPAS, which is the AFAC Emergency Management Professionalisation Scheme, we've worked with AFAC to see how they can enrich and embed and include content to better capture non-technical skills. And of course, we're highlighting that organisations themselves need to live up to their own commitments. There's a well-known model called the Learning by Doing, a 70-20-10, used in many jurisdictions. The challenge, of course, is how does an organisation pick up and provide some of those other activities that reinforce and enrich people's ability to practice, and develop and use non-technical skills. In terms of the potential initiatives, we've just outlined lots of ways that organisations can take advantage of tools. So we're trying to help and work with organisations to say where are the touch points where these can come in, that things like non-technical skills and team monitoring tools can be used. And so we've just highlighted a few of those here. A fundamental and easy one is individual development planning. You know, if you look across agencies, many agencies struggle to do what I'd suggest is a fairly fundamental practice of actually putting development plans in place that are meaningful and appropriate. Organisations taking on their own training, including within criteria for key roles, promotion, position descriptions, training and encouraging teams. And of course, the last point is just not using them just for emergency situations, but actually widespread across the organisation. Fundamentally, non-technical skills are positive, helpful, straightforward behaviours that help people work well together. So culturally, these are things that what you would say organisations should benefit from in a wider and broader range of roles. So things that have been helping us to encourage research utilisation, would probably first up just say continuity of both us and our relationships with partner agency staff. And we know that that can and is a challenge for organisations. And even the funding models for ourselves, those are all part of the story that we've, I think, already heard from other people about. The human-centred design it shifts the relationship and the way we approach how we talk, how we engage, and effectively invites and encourages and enables staff in those agencies to actually become much more part of the research process, and that's an important part. And they help us design maximally designed or well-designed products that are going to work for their agency, and then they can go on to champion it. Of course, robust support from agencies has been important, particularly those key relationships. Time to develop the research tools and resources. As you can imagine, these things take time, so the old cook time is important. Having a fairly clear big picture view so we remain focused, but we can also share and support the agency and get good alignment there. And in this case, we'd also say AFAC have been a really important enabler in helping us reach a broader audience. For instance, they supported an online delivery of our non-technical skills training across almost all agencies across Australia through the L&D network, etc. And of course, they've been involved in the review for MPUS and the public safety training package. Looking ahead to potential research, there's lots of things we could say here. I'll try and be measured. There's certainly lots of opportunity to further build and offer meaningful monitoring tools and dashboards for emergency management, incident management teams. Just last week I was talking to an agency about the need for also tools to help with handover, an ongoing issue of how do we conceptualise key issues, particularly at the state or regional control centre level. Non-technical skills for recovery practitioners. Very often people work in these difficult roles, and I don't think there's strong literature or good understanding of what might be some of the ways we think and help develop non-technical skills for that set of practitioners. We need to understand the interrelationship of non-technical skills. They do overlap and they have some relationships, and that further, and in particular, a further theoretical understanding between situational awareness and decision making. It's often described as a continuum, the front end and the back end of decision making. And there's been very limited research on situational awareness in recent years. And of course, there's an opportunity to, by building a better understanding, better explain and understand what is going on. And that gets to that the second to last point of the non-technical skill effectively provides a framework, an integrated framework that helps us better understand the space, both the demands and the requirements on people, and can help us better understand the implications of the various other things we may want to do around this, both technology and other systems. And of course, that's the lovely idea that it has both practical and theoretical implications, and nothing's so practical as a good theory. And the last point is just this idea of rounding out our broader understanding of those capabilities for people working in these roles. So alongside the technical and non-technical skills is thinking a bit about the personal skills as well. Thank you very much. Oh, all right. Okay, so I've got a question here. As natural disasters occur more frequently, do you see small teams across the sector, particularly volunteers, professionalising, or do you see small teams becoming less professional as they become risk numb? Oh, goodness. I'm going to think about that for a minute. Do you see more sense? Perhaps my initial comment about this question is there is some, what's the word? There can be some debate around this word professional, and some of you in the room might know where some of the conversation might go here. And probably the first idea for me is that if we're going to support people to do work, then we need to train them and develop them well. That's fundamentally the thing we need to do. So whether they're volunteers or paid, being well prepared for the work they're doing, I think, is the fundamental thing we have a responsibility to do. Risks none, that comes back to, again, I think, a development piece, making sure that we do prepare people adequately so they've got working knowledge of what the things that may bite them. There has been research done a little bit around this idea of risk. and the name will escape me for a minute, but this idea of what we call portal experiences, that, for instance, in the fire environment, close shaves are an important way that people do learn. Ideally, would not prefer people not to have close shaves, but if we can tell those stories and train and develop people, then hopefully we can try and maintain some level of appreciation of the risks that they might be taking on.
Thank you, Peter. Please welcome our second speaker, Leigh Kelson from Fire Tech Connect, who will. Leigh is bringing a very different perspective to this conversation. He is a technology entrepreneur, a cloud computing pioneer, and a media tech veteran. He has founded 10 ventures over the last 30 years and has had a number of successful exits. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm sure you can explain it to me.
It means I sold it.
Over his career, he's been a CEO of publicly listed companies involved in raising more than 100 million in funding and completed 2 successful IPOs on the Australian Stock Exchange. Wow. All right, welcome, Leigh.
Thank you. Is this my...
That's your clicker and that's your
clicker.
message.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I just want to set the stage here. I'm not an academic. I deferred university 37 years ago for a year. And I decided after 37 years maybe I should go back and get an education. So I have, over the last couple of years, pursued research in technology commercialisation, specifically focused around Australia's inefficiency in our ability to commercialise innovation. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. My last company, I completed a successful listing on the Australian Stock Exchange in 2013, and then I stayed in that space for 6 years, sat on a number of boards, and had a chief executive role for 6 years. And I exited that business in 2019 and relocated back to Noosa, which I had spent a lot of my time over the previous 20 years living, or at least having a base there, while I spent a lot of time in the US. And I also decided at that point that maybe I should educate myself. So I decided to do some research, and that was specifically around our commercialisation capability here in Australia. While I was in Noosa, I was introduced to a guy by the name of Chris Bowden out of the Peregian Digital Hub, and they were looking for an opportunity to sort of, I guess, position Noosa as a leader in a category of tech. You know, we're familiar with ag tech and med tech, fintech. But how could Noosa play a role and sort of own a position in a particular category? And we looked at environment tech and climate tech. It was after the 2019-20 fires when the Peregian Digital Hub literally nearly got burned down. And probably familiar with the big Peregian fire. In collaboration with the Noosa Shire Council and Chris Bowden at the Peregian Digital Hub, we founded essentially a for-purpose, not-for-profit organisation called Fire Tech Connect, and the mission of that organisation is to drive the adoption of next generation technologies in dealing with our catastrophic problem of significant fires. So I'm going to start today with some bad news, but it does get better. The bad news is that we're really average when it comes to input and output of our innovation in Australia. If you look at the World Innovation Index database, which is produced by the Intellectual Property Organisation. It comes out every year. I've been a student of this for many, many years. And it is with exasperation every year I look at this. And particularly interesting here is the Innovation Efficiency Index. And this is about what we put in terms of resources, financial and human resources, and what we get out in terms of high-value jobs, export opportunities, and intellectual property registration through patents. And there's some of the measures, but there are others. And you'll see here that typically we're up in the top 5 and 10 inputs in the world, and we languish around 25, 30, and sometimes even been worse than that in terms of our output. So the question that I started with is, how do we get better at that? And I guess drawing on my experience of having had a go at 10 ventures, I've had a couple of catastrophic failures. I've had a couple where I've got out with my shirt on my back. And I've had a couple where I've fortunately been able to sort of get through the valley of death. So there's 4 areas that I guess I've identified as, and this is just some of the construct. There's a whole lot of other variables that we need to take into account, but the first one is the adoption life cycle and the diffusion of innovation and how we uptake that innovation, and I'll explain a bit more about that. The venture life cycle, how do we support the venture through its life cycle, and most importantly through the valley of death, which I'll also touch on. And then how do we think about it in terms of systems operational readiness, and then the organisational change readiness component. So here's the diffusion of innovation model, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this, this essentially talks about how we adopt technologies. And if you look at the laggards at the end, which is the skeptics, I think of that as my grandfather who just bought his first CD. And at the front end, we see the innovators and the techies. They're the people who are getting onto streaming platforms. And the diffusion of innovation typically uptakes through the early stage adopters. They're risk takers. They like to be the first to try innovation. We then move into the early adopters. So they are aware of a need to change and they're comfortable adopting those ideas. And then we move into the early majority, late majority, and then onto the laggards who either never adopt or eventually adopt as other people are coming in that front end. And what's interesting about emergency services is this is the adoption maturity of the market that we're dealing with. So, and it's understandable, we're dealing with life and death and there's high risk involved and we need to prove the efficacy of these technologies. So the early majority are typically adopt these after seeing evidence that it works. So in emergency services, that's completely understandable and predictable. And then we're also dealing with the late majority. So that's a problem. We've got a change environment, a culture environment that we need to start thinking about. How do we bring those adopters earlier into the diffusion of the innovation to drive the adoption? Now, I'm going to talk about all this stuff very high level because I've only got 15 minutes and I'm just going to introduce some of these concepts. So here's the stages of a venture. Over my 35 years, I've spent a fair bit of time in this red area, and that essentially is really how do we take the business from an idea into a potential exit, IPO, merger, trade sale, whatever that exit may be. Now, whilst I'm not an academic, I have spent a lot of time doing research because every entrepreneurial mind will look first of all at the research of the market, of the opportunity, of the technologies, of who's doing what the investment flows are into that sector, and trying to connect the dots to see where the opportunity may be. Now, once we move out of that stage, and found the firm, then we've got into this proof of concept, developing business plans, working prototypes, and through the stages at the bottom, and then typically how we would get funded in that environment. And as we go along that, it gets harder and harder to get funded. And we need to sort of, do a trick, get a fish type of approach to building that, or what we refer to as bootstrapping. So the key commercialisation questions that I would ask, or that anybody that's looking at an opportunity to research the potentially commercial opportunity, would be customers, economics, technology and strategy as the 4 pillars. And that is the innovation desired? Is the innovation economically viable? Is the innovation technologically feasible? And is the innovation suitable to reach your target audience? Now, obviously there's a lot more complexity to this, but these are sort of 4 key areas that we can look at to say, if we're going to undertake some research in this area, these are the things we need to think about if we are cognizant of a commercial outcome. So typically when we think about the research to solution is along the TRL line of 1 to 9. Now, this was developed by NASA back in the 70s. They were putting things on rocket ships and they had no way of leveraging how ready they were to actually be used on those particular space vehicles. So I break this down into 3 sections. 1, 2 to 3 is that academia, basic research to advanced research to prove that feasibility. Then we move into this sort of technology development. So working prototypes, MVP, minimal viable product, and then getting into that commercialisation area where we're starting to trial, pilot, and ready for commercial launch of that product. So it's a 1 to 9, 3 sections, academia, into the tech development, and then into the business development. Now, I think one of the things when we refer to emergency services or the adoption of technologies, we need to move away from this into more of a systems readiness approach. And the reason that I believe that is because if you take the example of a mobile phone device and a headset, both of those technologies are technology readiness level 9. If you try to use those as a system to listen to your music through your phone, unless they're systems readiness level, you're not going to be able to use them. They're not much use to anybody. And it applies to the emergency service in terms of the adoption of the technology. It can't just be that your software works, it needs to be that your software is integrated and that your software is now systems readiness and, more importantly, operational readiness. And that path looks very different. So now what we're talking about is the 9 phases of the technology readiness into the phases of the integration readiness, where we go into interface, quality assurance control, accept, translate, structure information, verification, validation, and then into the systems readiness, systems demonstration, product development, operations and support. That's a long road to hoe to get to that point where we've actually now got an operational ready system. And then the fourth part is, how do we think about change readiness? So culture, business vision, sponsorship, governance, leadership and communication, and organisational workload. And we're looking at this from what I would say is the buy side. So most of what we talked about previously was the sell side, the tech companies, the organisations that are developing the innovation. This is now, how ready is the buy side to adopt this technology, and how do we start thinking about bridging the gap to get to an operational readiness stage? So that's all of the bad news. Now the good news is there's some amazing, exciting opportunities in technology. And one of the things we've been doing at FireTech is we've built a test bed laboratory in Noosa, which I'm going to touch on in a bit. But some of the really exciting emerging technologies around drones, machine learning, satellite detection, 5G networks, and the others there are showing a lot of promise, and we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of activity and a lot of investment flowing into these types of technologies. And if we think about how we apply those technologies to an operational response use case, then you can see from this there's a lot of areas that we can apply those technologies to. 4 areas that we're particularly interested in is bushfire intelligence and big data. And the key here is we don't need more data, we need more insight from the data. It's intelligent insight that we need, an actionable insight that can help move the needle in terms of how we respond to those particular fire emergencies. An interesting area is the internet of what I'm calling the internet of fires. It's the connectivity of all things to do with fires. So we've got the internet of things, now we've got the internet of fires, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then drones and autonomous systems, and how are we seeing the progress in these areas. So the internet of fires is a really interesting one. So we've got all sorts of sensors that throw off all data. And if you think about robotics, drones, any of these devices that we put into the field, or anywhere for that matter, whether it be appliances that are moving or they're stationary, they're throwing off data. So everything is generating data. And what we've done in Noosa, we've got 610 square kilometres, and we've got weather stations, mole probe, fuel probes, satellite ground truthing, artificial intelligence camera detection network that we've just installed and now in pilot trials, which I'm going to show you a little bit of a detection test that we did. And this is what the configuration looks like. It's all based on a LoRaWAN network. We've also got Starlink in there, and we have 5G networks in there. And then we've got all of these other interesting sensors, from people counting, vehicle counting, to, as I mentioned, all of the other atmospheric conditions and all the data. And what that gives us is real-time data. Now, we're making all of this data available to all researchers to access this information, to use to train any of the machine learning that you're doing. And the problem with this is that we just end up with more data. So what do we do with the data, and how do we take that machine learning and data science to benefit the operations of firefighting? So we're looking at things like remote sensing with weather and GIS data, fire ignition detection, fire and smoke spread, impact recovery mapping, fuel mapping, fire risk, and machine learning and physics informed fire spread models. We've got edge computing devices that we're now installing with the assistance of Amazon. And then we've got intelligent warning, real-time situational awareness, and this really from the fire ground through to the crews, the trucks, and then to the local regional IMTs. Structured fireground information, development of crew and health tracking, probabilistic fire spreading. You can see here that the area of data science in this is huge, and all of these devices, as I mentioned, all throw off data. So how do we start working with this? And this is some of the progress in some of the areas that we've identified. You can see some of it is well advanced in green, some of it needs a lot more work in yellow, and some of it is just at the early stages in red. And these are the areas that I think that if we were to double down on some of those red areas, we could make the most impact and most progress. So I don't know whether this is going to actually work for me. Can I... So is this connected or no? So I'm not going to be able to show you that, but this is actually the artificial intelligence detection camera network that we've just installed in Noosa. And this shows the cameras scanning the area. They've got a 360-degree view of the whole of the Noosa Shire area. And this particular test actually picked up a test fire, which was a control burn that we conducted about a month ago up in Noosa. So this is an area, again, in our test bed in Noosa, where we're putting these technologies in to try and prove the efficacy of them, and we're doing that in conjunction with Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, with a view that if we can't prove the efficacy, and I suppose the model I think of is the pharmaceutical. We don't take a innovation of a pharmaceutical product and start selling it direct to market. We have an intermediary like the Therapeutic Goods Administration, put it through its rigours, prove efficacy, test, go back to the drawing board, iterate from there. And that's really how I see we're going to create a pattern of progress in this area. And one of the other areas that we've got out in our environmental zone is autonomous systems. So we've got a drone fly zone, we've got a all-terrain vehicle area for testing all-terrain vehicles, and this is an example of an autonomous system we've been testing with Telstra and Rheinmetall. The Rheinmetall system is potentially a use case in search and rescue. The drone you're seeing there is connected to a 5G Telstra gateway, and we've been testing the integrations with this. So both of these products are Technology Readiness 9, and they're both at Integration Readiness 3. So we've got some work to do there. But that's all. So I'm done. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
You had a slide with inputs and outputs of different countries. I didn't see the US on that slide.
Yeah.
Is it not on there?
No, it wasn't. I noticed that too. Yep.
Where would that be?
The US are up there. They're up there in the top 10. Interestingly, it's sort of Germany, South Korea, Japan. They're sort of always in the top input to outputs. The US are in there, so I'm interested why they weren't there on that particular one. But
Any other questions? No?
okay.
Well, we have a chance to have further conversation in the panel. Thank you, Leigh. Finally, our third speaker for the day is Mahesh Prakash from Data 61 CSIRO. Dr. Prakash is a senior principal research scientist at CSIRO and leads a group of scientists, engineers and software professionals who develop and apply a diverse range of modelling and analytics techniques for urban environment applications, with a focus on emergency and disaster management. Please welcome Mahesh.
Thanks to the previous two speakers to actually, speak so eloquently about kind of research translation and the different flavors of it. I'm going to talk about innovation for operational response, but to start off with, I thought that I'll kind of talk a little bit about what is Data 61. I think a few of you know about it, but are not exactly sure what it's all about. Including Andrew, actually. Andrew asked me about this while we were at a workshop in Canberra. So I just took this from the Data 61 website, so I'm not making it up, okay? So it says that we are all about data, and we kind of think about data as currency. So that's both observed data as well as model data. And we see ourselves as a digital research network. Kind of working with partners and stakeholders
to improve the way Australia does things using digital capability. And our work is focused on around three goals. Okay, so driving the development and adoption of artificial intelligence in Australia. And artificial intelligence is being used in a very broad sense here. So it's not actually using the academic word artificial intelligence. So any knowledge that is created by the computer can be regarded as artificial intelligence. The second one, which is actually very pertinent to this particular audience, is putting digital science and technology at the heart of Australia's recovery and resilience to help solve our immediate challenges and to anticipate and prepare for future ones. So this is one of the three goals that Data 61 has, which basically says that we are very interested in improving the environment, the resilience of Australia, not just environment, but other aspects as well. And the last one is reinventing the way we do science using digital technology. So essentially the fact that there's a lot of data out there that we are not utilizing in a way we should be. So this kind of goes back to the comment that Leigh made. We've got lots of data. We're not creating as much insights and intelligence with the data that we have. So how can we improve that? So in terms of the programs that we have in Data 61 that is aiming to achieve these outcomes, we've got 4 of them: analytics and decision sciences, which is where I sit. And so folks in that particular program have got skill sets in statistics, both Bayesian statistics and traditional statistics, physics-based modeling and machine learning, cyber-physical systems, which is mainly focused on sensors and sensor networks and robotics, software and computational systems, very much focused on cryptography, cybersecurity, blockchain, software, and data security. So those are the 3 research programs. And then we've got engineering and design, which is very much an integral part of the research programs, but it's focused on product, user-centered design, and software engineering. The environment, agriculture, natural hazards, and climate risk is a sector within Data 61, and it's cross-cutting. And we develop a range of platforms, products, projects, and programs that are aligned with that sector. So in terms of the types of projects that we work on, and I'll kind of give you a few examples of what I mean by those. These are kind of aligned with the technology readiness levels that Leigh was speaking about. But I kind of think of it as application or research application readiness level. So Horizon 1, which is very much platform, product, and operationally focused, and this we tend to do in partnership with others. And typically it's the engineering and design program that leads those sorts of projects in collaborations with the research programs. Horizon 2 projects are more focused on research translation, and that tends to be led by the research programs along with the ND. And then you've got strategic applied research, which is mainly led by the research programs. So what's the role of platforms in Data 61? And this is kind of something that we have been building over the past few years. So the aim is that we actually try and do all those 3 phases of research, Horizon 1, 2, and 3, using a well-defined platform architecture, which is connected up so that the research to the research translation to the operationalization doesn't take as long as it used to take. Okay, so this is like a typical very high-level architecture for the environmental platforms that we are building. So the layer 1 there is essentially ingesting and storing the data that is typically created by the strategic research that gets done in this space. Now there's actually layers below that which I'm not talking about, otherwise it'll become too complicated. But you start there and then you kind of do the data transformation, creation of the APIs, and then on top of that you've got the analytics layer, which is more translation focused. So it's less about the underlying research, but it's more about the translation of that research in a domain sense so that it can be utilized either directly by the consumer or via some sort of a web-based front end. Now, putting it in this manner allows both the researchers as well as the people who are developing these systems in an operational sense to clearly understand what their role is. And through a range of projects that we have been working on, we have been kind of slowly but surely kind of fine-tuning this architecture so that we can get closer to a space where the underlying strategic research as well as the operationalization can be done in using the same platform. So quickly going through some examples of the different types of projects that we work on. So this is kind of similar to the sorts of things that Leigh was talking about. So we do a lot of work in fairly large-scale sensing for environmental resilience and adaptation. And this is focused on things like impact assessment for rehabilitation and management, kind of looking at crop damage, real-time assessment, and so on. This is still in the research phase, so it's not like we are doing it with a specific operational focus. We're actually looking at different types of sensor technologies to try and see what works and what doesn't work from an analytics perspective, from the perspective of seeing what sort of information can be gleaned from the data, which is fit for purpose for the problem that we are trying to address. The second example is more focused on climate-related financial risk and uncertainties. So this is kind of the confluence of financial modeling and climate modeling. So what we are trying to do there is trying to understand what is the impact of climate change on a range of financial investments. So early days here, but we are working quite closely with local governments who are providing us with the necessary data that needs to go into the financial modeling, and we've got the climate data with us, and we're trying to see how they actually kind of work with each other. So this is again strategic research, but it's being carried out using the same sort of platform technologies that we have developed. Moving on to Horizon 2 projects, we're doing large-scale sensing for environmental resilience. So kind of installing sensors on some of these animals, so animal sensing, as well as looking at in situ physiology of animals, health conditions, stresses, and all those sorts of things. So again, this is kind of somewhere in between becoming an operational tool and doing some early stage research. So it's not there yet, but we are working with our partners to actually develop this capability further. Mainly focused on kind of the agricultural sector as well as in the biosecurity space. The second one example is around evacuation modeling and evacuation management. So this is work that we're doing in collaboration with RMIT University, but very closely with state-based agencies. With Victoria, with New South Wales, Western Australia, and more recently Queensland. So there are two capabilities that we are developing here. One of them is quite widespread. So we are looking at evacuability metrics or evacuability scores to understand where the evacuation hotspots might be. And once you do that, we then apply the more granular agent-based modeling approaches to look at where the choke points are and to kind of start looking at what needs to happen from an infrastructure, kind of managing, we haven't gone down to the space of real-time assessment yet, but this is more to kind of plan for a particular event as well as to actually see how you can improve the infrastructure to reduce some of those evacuation choke points. Again, this is not operational yet. We are learning through use cases that we are working on with different agencies around Australia. And then finally moving on to a couple of projects which are very close to being operationalized. The first one that you may be quite familiar with, Spark. So this is now being split up into two components, Spark Operational, which we are pursuing in collaboration with AFAC, where they've got the operational remit, but we are building the operational system for them. So that's basically what I would call a locked-down version of Spark to ensure that whatever gets produced has got provenance associated with it. The other one is Spark Research, which is being done in close collaboration with the Australian Research Data Commons. And Spark Research is something that we are building so that all researchers can actually utilize it to improve fire science in a range of different ways, through improvements to inputs, through improvements to fuel models and fire models, as well as the validation and benchmarking part of it. And that's where some of the input data sets that you'd asked for would also be quite useful when it comes up. And both of these projects are also being partially funded by the Minderoo Foundation. I'll probably skip that in the interest of time. That was just a video of Spark. Maybe it's stopped playing. I'll skip that. Finally, I'll talk about climate services for agriculture. So this is a project that we are working on in close collaboration with the Bureau and the Federal Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. The main aim of this project is to help Australian farmers and farm advisors to deal with climate variability and climate change, including the effects of drought. So this project actually started in Feb 2021. It's a live platform that anyone who's interested in can actually go and view. It's a national scale product. We are getting close to release 4 now. So every 6 months, we've got new releases. The initial focus was on data delivery, but increasingly we are focusing on insights for adaptation, and that's where things are heading. And in this particular project, there's a massive emphasis on user-centric design, working with the farmers to make sure that what we are actually building is fit for purpose for their needs. And one of the key learnings that we've got out of this project is that you can use the data and serve it up in all sorts of different ways for it to be useful for different types of end users. So that's the website if anyone is interested in jumping in and having a look at it. You'll see the farm view. That's the one that's actually open to anyone for free. But we've also got a map explorer, which tends to be used more by corporate farmers. And then we've got the APIs for people who want to innovate on top of what we have actually built, which has been really good because we can't do everything ourselves. We need partners. That's it really from me. Thank you. Oh, sorry. The biosecurity threats are on the radar for the whole of CSIRO. And so at some point, we will be engaged with that. We are actually looking at pests and diseases as one of the key concerns that we all need to think about, but we are looking at it from a climate lens, a weather lens. Yes, so the short answer is yes, but it'll probably happen in the next year or two. Thank you.
I think, so now we'll move into the panel session. And whilst we're going into the panel, we were going to start a live poll. If you could do that, and from the live poll we can develop up a word cloud. And we'll see, that will be our first question and will be the response from our panellists to the word cloud. So if you're in charge of the National Treasury for operational response, where would you put the bulk of your funds for research? It's dream time. What's your response? What's your intuitive response to this and the research that you do, and how does that play out in the way that you expect it to play out?
I suppose when I think about prevention, I think about it in a couple of different ways, and I suppose part of it's about understanding the threats and risks, and as we've discussed, anticipating those or understanding those and what may or may not go right or wrong. But I suppose I also see prevention from actually preparing ourselves well, so we actually prevent often the things that come along and getting worse. So in some ways I think it more of a protective way, I suppose, than element of the prevention. So I think about it perhaps that way as a really helpful way of how do we better manage the events that will come our way. I've got a colleague who talks about, Ben Brooks, who talks about this idea of systems will always at times be stretched, and the question is, how do we cope ugly, in his words, basically. So how do we actually, when we are stretched or pushed, and it will probably happen, how do we do our best to maintain some sort of, reasonable response to whatever's been going along. So I suppose that's more my prevention thinking.
Definitely.
Yeah, look, I feel like at an individual level, to be able to prevent a really massive event is going to be quite challenging. So it needs to be happening at a all of government level. But I feel like anticipation and adaptation is something that we all of us can actually contribute towards. And I think with the work that I do and my team does, that is something that we would like, we want to try and empower people to be able to do that. So knowledge leads to anticipation, and then hopefully some sort of adaptation outcome, so that when something like this happens, people are not completely surprised by it and are able to actually deal with it early rather than having to wait for it and then suddenly realizing that, oh shit, I never anticipated this and it's happened to me.
Leigh, in terms of commercialisation and when you're looking at this and you're seeing what people in the sector are kind of thinking about, what does it make you think?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I'm not really qualified to respond from a research perspective, but I think if we're talking, prevention to me is, I mean, I don't know how you're going to prevent, but we can be more resilient. And then the question for me is, how do we become more resilient? So from a commercialisation perspective, how do we actually get some of these systems operational and move the needle? We need to be supporting the life cycle from not just the research and not just from the pilot sort of stage, but right throughout the whole life cycle. And so if I was going to be investing in that, I'd be saying, how do we better invest in supporting the life cycle of these innovations, and not just from a capital perspective, but a resource and capability development.
Right. Thanks. Okay, thanks everyone, and I think we'll go back to the questions, if we can. Whilst we're doing that, I'll ask, I've got a couple of questions here I can ask. It's a question for the whole panel. What are the significant barriers to knowledge translation in operational response in the sector, from your perspective? So we'll start with Mahesh.
Sorry, what was the question again? The barriers to knowledge translation?
Yes.
I think that the issue that I'm seeing is that there's some really good talent out there when it comes to the strategic research side of things, and then there's the operational folks. And it feels as if there aren't that many people who've got their right kind of KPIs to deal with the in-between bit. So taking that research and then translating it into something that's very close to being operational in nature, so that the operational folks can pick it up and run with it. So there's that gap, and I call it a KPI gap, and you might call it the valley of death. Right?
Yep.
So different people could call it different things, but there's a lack of funding that
Yep.
needs to go into kind of taking really amazing research that gets done to an outcome that can actually be used by end users.
Right.
And there are a few organizations that are taking on that role, but I think more investment needs to go into it.
Yep. Leigh, do you have a response? Yep.
Can you just phrase the question?
What are the significant barriers to knowledge translation and operational response?
So I think this is an interesting one. Australia's an interesting place. We have state of origin and then we have Olympic teams. And whenever it comes to innovation, we inevitably default to the state of origin. Whereas in other things, we take the Olympic team view. So I think, the ability to collaborate and sometimes the misplaced perception that IP is valuable on its own. If you think about any innovation, it is usually two inventions that are brought together to create the innovation. And so, to me, it's about collaboration and opening the communication and sharing knowledge, and that's the way we're going to translate that. But in the innovation sector, my experience over the last 20 odd years is that it's a state game, not a national game.
That's interesting. Peter, did you have a response?
I think we can see where we tend to succeed, and it's often dependent on some really key relationships. So the challenges that forming and maintaining those relationships and working in a more human-centered design approach for us has been successful. But we're also very aware that there's actually in our experience, seems to be a smaller number of people and agencies, sometimes with the bandwidth to take on the role of working on a research project as an engaged end user. So often the tension we have is these people are quite stretched, and they're often the same people who put their hands up for multiple projects. So I think, Loriana, you and I were talking about this idea of givers, that there's some people who actually are more forward-thinking, put their hand up, but by the way, they're actually managing several of those projects, and that can really stretch them. And maybe that's not always easy in organisations, that they're not always as well supported, and perhaps that's, I think, part of the cultural challenge that perhaps some agencies or people in agencies struggle with. So I think that sort of sits in behind the challenges of finding those people and then being able to work with them successfully.
Oh, we've got another question here. I'll probably ask these last three, and then we'll finish up. How do the panel see the relationship between non-technical skills and innovation at an operational level? Peter, I think you can be the first one to answer that.
I'd suggest that non-technical skills from an agency perspective are a way to help agencies create a slightly more straightforward culture, a more direct way of talking to each other, and an openness for listening and engaging. So, from a cultural or broad level, I think the non-technical skills embrace various sort of climate aspects which are quite helpful for, I think, embracing an innovation. So that's perhaps a good place to start.
I want to read that question again.
How do the panel see the relationship between non-technical skills and innovation at an operational level?
I wouldn't actually kind of, I don't think about people who've got non-technical skills to be people who can't innovate. So kind of, it's mainly I think it's got to do with kind of giving people the space as well as the environment for them to kind of think innovatively. So kind of putting them into kind of two different baskets, saying, if you're technical, you'll be innovative, and if you're non-technical, I mean, that's how I'm reading the question, but maybe that's not how it's supposed to be read. So I feel like innovation should be kept at its core, and we should actually allow people to think innovatively, and that would actually lift up the game overall. Whether you're technical or non-technical, it actually doesn't really matter.
I think from an innovation perspective, we look at innovation purely as investment, and what we don't tend to do is decouple funding from capability development. And I think there's very specific skills around innovation and being able to drive innovation, develop innovation, and ultimately commercialise it. And we're talking about commercial from a financial outcome, but really we're talking about an operational readiness so that we can actually start to use this innovation in the field. So I think we need to decouple the idea of funding and capability development so that we have a focus on how do we build capability around the innovation skills that you need to move you through that life cycle, because we are light on in some of that area.
Okay, so I think we'll go to the next one, which is, it seems like there's a lot of different sensor networks tested and possibly deployed over the last 15 years. How do they all interact and add value to one another, or do they die?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Well, I can only say from a perspective of the sensor network that I've installed is that it's open to connect. I think that's imperative. That's how do we build a mesh to pull the data together. Biggest problem in that is the infrastructure. People think about camera networks, sensor networks are really challenging to scale. So we have to be selective about where we put them. They need to be in high risk areas. You're not going to scale. The idea that you're going to scale these sensor networks and have sensors through every environmental area in a country like Australia is just not going to happen. So, but then what often happens with these sensor networks is that people don't look at the operational expenditure. They just look at the capex. So capital expenditure to put them in, the operational expenditure to maintain them is the thing. That's why they die.
Thanks.
I can't agree with what Leigh just said. I mean, the other thing I'd like to add is you tend to install the sensors and then you figure out what to do with them. Whereas you need to think about what are you going to do with it? What are the use cases that are going to be valuable that will come out of it before you actually install these sensors, and that will also tell you how to install them, and that will also help you to actually keep it going. You're not scratching your heads figuring out, how am I going to monetize the outcomes?
Does CSIRO also look to what they're doing now, but what they might look at in the future as well when they're doing projects like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And at least with the team that I work with, we tend not to. So we work with existing sensor data that are available, like the one that Leigh has set up, and we are trying to actually understand how to get value from it, rather than saying, okay, let's actually go ahead and install more, because there's plenty of them out there. The challenge is to actually see what value we can derive from it.
And we've got one last question from Matthias Bott. Where are we? Yeah. Oh no, we've got this one. What's your ideal governance arrangements for digital platforms and natural hazards at all levels? State and local government. I don't know what is that country? Commonwealth. State and local governments to talk to each other.
That's a work in progress. I'm still scratching my head and figuring out what that. I think we will get some answers to that question in about 2 months. There's some really interesting work that's happening with the Australian Climate Service, which is a federal government entity, and some of the work that is being done with the states and with AFAC through Spark. And that will give us a bit of an insight around, is this going to be smooth sailing or is it going to be horrible, right? So the technology is actually very well developed, right? There's no technological challenges in this at all. The issue is to do with the governance aspects of it and the trust aspects of it. So I feel like it should not be an insurmountable problem, but let's wait and watch.
I don't think I've got much more to add than that. It's just work in progress. It is interesting, but I think it sort of defaults back to my earlier position around this state approach. It seems like we're selective in terms of what suits us when it's a state-based approach or a national approach. So, as Mahesh said, it's work in progress. I can't really add much more than that.
All right, we've got this final question now. Emergency management knowledge and capacity is a public good. Innovation in emergency management should, in my view, also flow back to the public agency. How is commercialisation of innovation compatible with that public interest?
I mean, it's a really good question. It's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? Because we typically when we talk about commercialisation, we're talking about commercial outcomes, and we talk about addressable markets and how the market is either growing or whether it's contracting. And in this case, we're working particularly in the area that I'm focused in is in the fire responses. We're seeing this huge growing addressable market all over the world. And so it's always that sort of conundrum as to should I be addressing it as an exciting growing addressable market when it's really an exciting growing, it's not an exciting growing, it's a problem. But then I think, well, it's no different to an approach to trying to get a cure for a disease. Yes, it's a huge problem, and yes, it's, cancer drug treatments, they're huge problems. Pharmaceutical companies have monopolised on that. It's a really interesting question, but I think that ultimately, from my perspective, there is an element of changing the way we view the emergency services organisations, and whether they, probably going to be controversial here, and say whether they should remain purely public funded and whether there should be some privatisation of some elements of those organisations that support the greater public emergency response organisations. There's examples of it in Europe and there's examples of it in the United States. Not such great outcomes in the United States, but certainly better outcomes in Europe. Look, an interesting question. Probably, maybe that doesn't answer the question, but.
So I guess the way I see this is that you can actually make innovation out of the research that goes into these sorts of areas, which can be very valuable in other areas. One example is if you're developing drone technology that can actually withstand really high temperatures, which is very much pertinent to the bushfire space, bushfire management space. That material science research that you do can actually then be taken to a lot of other areas, which can give you that commercial benefit. So in some ways, the way I see this whole space is you derive that commercial benefit by doing public good, but make the money from elsewhere. And another example that I can give is this climate risk space is a massive space. We actually operate in two areas in that space. We work with local government, state government, and the federal government to actually improve resilience outcomes for the community. And that's taxpayers' money. We can't actually charge for it. But when it comes to banks who are actually fleecing all of us, we don't feel bad about fleecing them, really. Oh, actually not fleecing them, but taking some money out of them. I hope there's nobody from banks here.
What a great place to end the conversation. Let's charge the banks. Peter, do you have anything to add?
I suppose it's more an observation rather than necessarily directly from my research. It's just, I'm aware, and probably from a health setting where, for instance, our well-known hospitals developed a really good decision support system for, the emergency room, the trauma rooms. And the question for them is, primarily they've built it to do a better job in saving lives or helping really sick people. That's primarily their motivation. But if there's an opportunity for them to sell that product elsewhere and reinvest and improve the product, then you would say that's the prudent and right thing to be doing. So there's a tension here between serving your community that you're looking after, but also where there's opportunities, then you should be where you can, creating commercial opportunities that you can improve and reinvest and keep on moving forward. So I think you need to get that balance right.
So true.
the last thing I'd like to say is actually if Australia can be a world leader in this space, there's an export market, right? So we shouldn't ignore that fact.
I just add to that comment, I think that's a really good approach. We use the space program as an example where, so many things have been invented, innovations for the space program that have then been served either both from a commercial purpose for in use cases or also for the public good. So I think as long as we continue to drive the innovation outcomes, then we present ourselves with options.
Great. Well, I'll have to leave it there. We're running 15 minutes over time, so hopefully we won't be too late for the session in the other room. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you on the next session.